A 25-year-old cowboy was forced to marry the widow the whole town feared. The preacher read from a page he didn't look at. I could hear a horse stamping outside and a crow calling somewhere past the church roof, and I stood there in my only good shirt, still damp across the shoulders from where I'd tried to press the wrinkles out with a wet rag that morning, and I thought, this is how a man ends. Her name was Delia Crane. She was 41 years old. She'd buried 2 husbands, which alone would have been enough to set tongues going in a place like Creedmoor. But it wasn't the dead husbands that made people move to the far side of the road when they saw her coming. It was the way she looked at a man when he said something stupid. It was the fact that she'd once walked into Roy Stetler's feed store and told him his scale was off by 4 pounds, and that she expected him to account for every shortfall she'd been absorbing for the past 6 years, and he had. It was that her land, 1,000 and some acres of broken Caliche Ridge country, was fenced, watered, and profitable in a year that had bent grown men into the dirt. People said she must have made some arrangement with the devil. People say a lot of things. I was nobody from nowhere. My name is Cal Britton, and at 25 I had a horse, a bedroll, a good eye with a rifle, and the particular kind of pride a man has when he doesn't have much else. I've been working a ranch up near the Medina River for 2 seasons, and I came into Creedmoor on a Thursday to collect wages my boss owed me. He wasn't in town. What he left for me was a note with a deputy, and the note said I'd been signed over. I read that note 3 times, turning it in my hands like it might say something different from a different angle. It didn't. My boss, a man named Aldous Fitch, had borrowed money from Delia Crane 17 months prior. He had not repaid it. The instrument of repayment, which she had apparently agreed to in a moment of either charity or cunning that I still can't entirely account for, was the delivery of one able-bodied ranch hand, preferably young, preferably reliable to her employ, in service of her land, for a period of not less than 1 year. Aldous Fitch had decided I was the man. The deputy gave me a look like he was sorry. Then he gave me directions to the Crane Ranch. I didn't go that day. I sat in the one saloon Creedmoor had, which was called the Mule for reasons nobody seemed to remember, and I drank 1 beer and thought about my options. My options were, ride for the Crane place and work out my year, or ride the other direction and be a man who ran from his obligations, even if those obligations had been assigned to me without my knowledge or consent by a coward who'd already left the county. I sat there a good while. The beer went warm. I paid for it and rode out. The road to her place took me past 3 other ranches, and at each one somebody came out to the fence line to watch me pass. Just watch. Nobody waved. I found out later that word travels fast in a place that small, and they all knew where I was headed, and some of them had placed bets. The gate to the Crane Ranch was iron, which was unusual. Everything behind it was orderly in a way that felt almost severe. The fence is tight. The grass grazed down to a sensible level but not to nothing. A water tank that was clean and full. A barn with a new tin roof that caught the late sun like a heliograph. The house itself was limestone, low and wide, with a gallery across the front and honeysuckle working its way up the east post. She was standing on that gallery when I rode in. She didn't wave either. I stopped 10 feet out and took off my hat, which cost me something, because I wasn't sure I was the kind of man who owed her that. But my mother had raised me in the one particular direction of manners, if not others. She looked at me for a long time. Then she said, "You're younger than I expected." I said, "I'm 25. She said, "I know what you are." Then she came down off the gallery steps and walked around my horse in a slow circle, looking at me and the animal both, and I sat there and let her do it because there wasn't a dignified alternative. When she came back around to the front, she put her hand on my horse's nose, and he, who was generally not a trusting animal, dropped his head into it. "What's his name?" she said. "Robbles." "Why Robbles?" "He came with it." She looked at the horse another moment, Then she looked at me. "You eaten?" It wasn't a question. I hadn't, she knew. That first meal was at a table big enough for 8 people, set for 2. She'd made venison and roasted squash and something with dried chilies that had enough heat to make my eyes water, which I did not comment on. She ate like she was comfortable with silence, and I ate like I hadn't had a meal made by a woman in longer than I wanted to admit, and we didn't talk much until she put down her fork and said, "Aldous Fitch is a weak man." He was a weak man when I loaned him that money, and I knew it. What I didn't know was whether the men who worked for him were cut from the same cloth. I said, "And?" She said, "And you rode out here." She got up and cleared the plates, and that was that. I didn't understand in those first weeks what I was walking into. I thought it was employment under duress. I treated it the way you treat something unpleasant but finite. You put your head down and you get through it. I was up before she was, usually, and working before the sun was properly above the ridge. There were 400 head of cattle and 30 horses, and 1,000 small maintenance tasks that a piece of land in that country required constantly, and I threw myself into them with the specific energy of a man who is managing his pride by staying too busy to think about it. She watched me work, not obviously, but I felt it, the way you feel someone's attention even when their back is turned. I'd come around the corner of the barn and she'd be there at the fence, looking at something in the middle distance, but the angle was wrong and I knew. The other hand on the place was an old man named Garfield who had a bad hip and strong opinions about the right way to string wire, and he and I got along after he understood I was going to do things his way while I was learning, and my way after I knew enough to have one. He'd been with Delia Crane for 11 years. On my 4th day there, I asked him about the dead husbands. He said first one was her father's choice, died of fever, she wasn't but 23. Second one she chose herself, Thomas Crane. Good man mostly, got kicked by a horse in his own barn, skull. He was dead before she finished running from the house. I said, "That's bad luck." Garfield looked at me with the patience of a very old rock. He said, "That's life, boy. Don't make the mistake of thinking it says something about her." I told him I didn't. He said, "You will, everybody does first." I thought about that more than I should have. She didn't talk much in those early weeks, but when she did, it was precise. She'd come out to where I was working and say, "The east fence line has a washout at the 3rd post from the cottonwood," and that was all, and she'd go back to whatever she'd been doing, and I'd go deal with the washout. There was a quality to her like a good knife, no extra metal anywhere. The first time she made a joke I almost missed it, because it was dry as a creek bed in August, and delivered with the same flat face she used for everything else, and Garfield had to nudge me with his elbow. She glanced over at my delayed laugh with something that I thought was appreciation, and then she looked away. The town came after her in the 2nd month. Not in one piece, in the way towns work, which is through proxies and whispers. A man named Cole Warwick, who had land adjacent to hers on the south side, started letting his cattle drift through a gap in the shared fence line that somehow kept repairing itself on his side and unraveling on hers. The gap was not an accident, and we both knew it. I rode out with Garfield to fix it for the 3rd time, and Garfield said, "Warwick's been after that south pasture since Thomas died. He figures a woman alone." He paused. He figured wrong on the last 4 attempts. I asked what happened to the last 4 attempts. Garfield made a noise that was almost a laugh. She filed on him, twice in county court and once with the land office. Cost him more than the pasture was worth, which was her precise intention. He worked a fence staple loose and receded it. She don't raise her voice. She don't threaten. She just finds the lever and she pushes it. I started watching the gap myself, mornings and evenings. I didn't say anything to her about it. 3 weeks later, I rode up on 4 of Warwick's steers coming through a section that had been cut, not frayed, and I drove them back, and then I rode to Warwick's gate, and I told the hand who came out to tell Warwick that if I found cut wire again, I would bring the piece to the county sheriff myself, And I would also bring the man I'd find to identify as the one who'd cut it, because I'd been watching, and I had a face in mind. I don't know if Warwick believed me. I had a face in mind. The wire stopped getting cut. I didn't tell Delia Crane any of this. She found out anyway. I still don't know how. And one evening she came out to where I was brushing down Robbles, and she stood in the barn door and said, "I heard about Warwick." I said, "Nothing to hear." She said, "Cal." It was the first time she'd used my name. I kept brushing. She said, "Thank you." I said, "I work here." There was a pause, then she said, "Yes, you do," and she went back inside. Garfield, who had been pretending to repair a halter in the corner, said nothing, but he smiled at the wall. The thing that changed, the thing I couldn't have predicted, was the night in October when the temperature dropped 40 degrees in 6 hours, and the cattle started walking into the wind instead of away from it, which is what cattle do when they're fixing to freeze, and which means they will walk clear off the edge of a canyon if you let them. I woke up because Robbles was making noise. He could feel it in the air before I could. By the time I got to the barn, she was already there, saddled up on a gray mare I'd never seen move fast, lantern hung off the saddle horn, hat pulled low. She looked at me and said, "North Quarter, there's a draw." We rode into that dark for 3 hours. The cold came in waves that had weight to them, and the wind threw grit that found every gap in a collar, and we worked those cattle by lantern and by the sound of them, and by 15 years of her knowing where every fold of ground lay on her own land. I lost count of the times she moved before I saw the reason to move, cut before I saw what needed cutting, knew which direction a heifer would go before it knew itself. I was not slow with cattle. I was not inexperienced. But I had never worked alongside someone who understood land and animals, the way she understood that land and those animals, not as separate things to be managed, but as one system she had learned by heart over years of paying the closest possible attention. At one point, maybe 2 in the morning, we had the bulk of them turned and moving south, and I looked across the herd in the lantern light, and she was there on the gray mare, her back straight, her face turned into the wind to read something in it, her hands easy on the reins, not afraid, not uncertain, just working at 2 in the morning in the cold, doing the thing that needed doing because it needed doing. I had a thought that stopped me for a second, which was, I would not want to be any other place right now, not because of the cattle or the cold or the night, because of the particular company. I pushed that thought down and kept working. We lost 4 animals. It would have been 30 or 40 without the early start, and she knew it. When we came back to the barn in the gray before dawn, fingers past feeling, horses blowing hard, she swung down and didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, 4, like she was filing it somewhere. I said it would have been worse. She said, yes, it would have been. Then she looked at me straight, and in the early light her eyes were the color of creek water over limestone, pale and clear and paying attention, and she said, "You knew how to move them." I said, "I've done this work a while." She said, "No, there's men who have done this work longer than you've been alive and don't know how to move them. You felt where they were going to go." She held my gaze for another second. "Where'd you grow up?" I told her, "East Texas, hardpan country, not much. My father ran a few head, and I ran them beside him from the time I could sit a horse." She nodded like she was placing something. Then she said, "Go warm up, there's coffee." The coffee was already made. She'd had it on before we left, I realized. She'd thought of it before we rode out. I sat at that big table in the cold before dawn light and drank 2 cups and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in a long time, which was being exactly where I was supposed to be. That's a feeling that doesn't come often and doesn't stay long and costs you when it goes. There is a particular quality to life on a piece of land when 2 people are working the same ground, and it builds slowly, and most of the time you don't notice it building. You start to know where the other person will be before you look. You develop a shorthand that isn't words, the way she'd turn her head slightly when she wanted me to move left, The way I'd wait in a doorway 2 extra seconds because she was usually 1 sentence behind where she seemed to be done. You stop negotiating the small things and start moving in concert, the way a good team of horses does when they've been together long enough. I noticed I was looking for her, not urgently, just noting her location the way you note where the sun is without trying. I noticed I saved things to tell her. Small things. The pair of herons I'd seen on the tank that morning. The particular stubbornness of the red roan gelding who would not let himself be caught on Tuesdays but was fine every other day of the week. An odd tool I'd found in a corner of the barn that neither Garfield nor I could identify. She'd receive these reports with her face quiet and her attention real, and occasionally she'd say something back that was worth waiting for. And I found I was looking forward to the end of the day in a way I hadn't looked forward to anything in some time. Garfield watched all of this with the specific contentment of a man whose longest bet was coming in. I didn't let myself say what it was for a while. I am not a man given to self-deception, but there is a particular kind of truth you hold at arm's length for as long as you can, because once you stop holding it at arm's length, everything gets harder. I held it at arm's length until sometime in November when I was in the barn alone, repairing a cinch by lamplight, and she came in to check on the pregnant mare in the back stall, and the lamplight caught her in a way that was, I don't know, plain and total. Like something I hadn't known I was looking for had been there the whole time. I looked at her hands on the mare's neck and her profile and the economy of her movements, and I thought, this is a good woman. This is a good woman, and she is 41 years old and I am 25, and there is not a man in this county who would not think I was a fool, and I could not care less. I did not say any of this. I finished the cinch. Christmas came and Creedmoor had a thing they did at the church, more social than religious. People bringing food and children running in the yard and the men standing around fires talking about weather and cattle prices. She asked me, almost as an aside, if I wanted to go. I said yes. I think we both understood what yes meant. I had not been into town with her before. I saw immediately what it was to move through a place beside Delia Crane. People didn't ignore her. You can't ignore her. But there was a quality to their attention that fell somewhere between wariness and respect, and it was heavily weighted toward her. And I understood then something Garfield had tried to tell me early on, which was that the town's opinion of her was not a simple thing and not entirely hostile. There were women who nodded at her with something that looked like solidarity. There were men who straightened up when she passed them in a way that had nothing to do with attraction and everything to do with the recognition of competence. There were also people who looked at me, the young man walking beside her, with frank curiosity, calculation in it. One man, Warwick, watched me from across the yard the whole evening. I looked back once steadily until he found something else to look at. She did not seem to notice. I think she noticed. On the way back late, the night cold and the horses steady in the dark, she said, out of what felt like nowhere, "My second husband, Thomas, he was a good man. Quiet, and he had good judgment, and he worked beside me without making me feel like I needed to explain myself." She paused. People thought it was strange. A younger woman running her own land, a man who didn't assert himself over it. They said things. Another pause. I got used to people saying things. I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "How much younger was he?" She turned her head toward me in the dark. 7 years. I said, "I'm 16 years younger than you." She said, "I know your age, Cal." The horses walked. There was no moon, but the stars were excessive, the kind of sky you only get when you're a long way from anywhere. I said, "Is that why you haven't said anything?" She thought about this for longer than I expected. Then she said, "I'm not in the habit of acquiring things I can't keep." I thought about that. I said, "I stayed when I didn't have to." She said, "What?" I said, "My year, I could have left at 6 months. Fitch's debt wasn't binding past the original agreement once Aldous sold his stock. Garfield told me about 2 months in. The legal hold was gone. I didn't leave." I paused. "I didn't want to." The horses walked. She said, I didn't know that. I said, I know you didn't. A long silence, then quiet, why didn't you say? I said, I was trying to figure out how. She did not reach for me that night. That is not her nature, and quick movements toward unexamined things is not mine either. What happened instead was slower and more real, which was that over the following weeks she began to talk to me in the evenings in a way she hadn't before, not longer, but differently, like the door was open on a room that had been closed. About Thomas. About the first husband whose name she barely said and didn't say with feeling. About her father, who had believed in her capabilities when almost no one else had, and whose death had left her both freer and more alone than she'd known how to manage for a while. About what it was to build something on ground that didn't want to cooperate, the land, and the life on it both. I talked too, more than I usually do, about my father's land and what it had gone for after he died. About the years between, working for other men on other men's ground and not minding it and not loving it either, the particular absence of working hard at something that wasn't yours. About riding into Creedmoor that Thursday with the intention of collecting my wages, and the way the day had not gone the direction I'd anticipated. She laughed at that. It was the first time I'd heard her laugh, not the dry sound she made at her own jokes, but an actual laugh, short and real and entirely unguarded. I felt it like something physical. You looked, she said, like a man walking to his own hanging. That's about how I felt. And now, I said, now I look forward to getting up in the morning. She looked at me across the table with those clear eyes and didn't say anything, and in the silence was everything. The proposal, when it came from her side, which I should have expected. It was a Tuesday, and I remember because of the red roan gelding who always evaded catching on Tuesdays, and I had been trying to corner him in a patient way for 20 minutes, and she walked out to the paddock fence and watched for a minute and then said, "You should ask Garfield. He knows the trick of that horse." I said, "What trick?" She said, "He hates the sound of the gate latching. He's fine if you leave it swinging." I looked at her. I said, "How long have you known that?" "Since last spring." Something almost apologetic crossed her face, which I had never seen there before. "I kept meaning to tell you." I said, "Why didn't you?" She said, "I liked watching you work it out." A pause. "That's probably not the right thing to say." I said, "No, it's I don't mind. And then, because I was thinking about this, you watch me a lot." She said, "Yes." I said, "I watch you too." She had her hands on the top rail of the fence, and she looked out at the horse, and then she said, still looking at the horse, "I'd like to know if you intend to stay past your year." I said, "I've intended to stay past my year since about October." She said, "I'd like to know if you intend to stay permanently." A pause. I said, "I'd like to stay permanently." A pause. She said, "You should know that this land is mine and the house is mine and the arrangements of it are mine. I have done this twice already, and I know how I need it to go." I said, "Good. That means one of us has thought it through." She turned and looked at me then, and her face was unguarded in a way I'd seen only once before, the early morning after the cold weather drive, in the lamplight with the coffee going. She looked at me like she was making sure of something. Then she said, "You're a good hand, Cal Britton." I said, "I know." She said, "I don't say that easily." I said, "I know that too." She turned back to the fence and said, almost to the horse, "I'll go to town this week. I'd rather get it done without ceremony. Preacher Nell owes me a favor, and I'd rather not make an occasion of it." I said, "Fine by me." She said, "You don't care about ceremony." I said, "I care about what happens after." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "So do I." The preacher read from a page she didn't look at. That is where I started this, and I come back to it now because I want to tell you what I didn't tell you then. What I was actually thinking, standing there in that damp shirt, in the small church that smelled of old wood and lamp oil, with the crow calling outside. I was thinking, I arrived here as a debt. I was a line item in a man's accounting, a piece of property transferred to settle an obligation, and I rode out here with my pride and my good eye and my horse and nothing else, and I expected to get through a year and go. I expected to be nobody's anything, which was what I was accustomed to. I was thinking, I do not know the name of the man who is usually the one doing the choosing in these situations, who rides in with money and prospects and his family's land behind him. I do not know his name because he was never here. He was imagined by a town that was waiting for a certain story, and the story didn't come. What came was this. What came was a woman who let a roan horse show me my own blind spots, who made coffee before a cold night ride without announcing it, who told me I knew how to move cattle in a way that made me understand she wasn't paying a compliment but simply being accurate, and who said I would like to know, if you intend to stay permanently in the same tone, she used to describe a fence line washout. Delia Crane looked at me during the ceremony the way she looks at things she has decided on, not warm in the way people imagine when they picture love, not soft, clear, the way she had looked at the problem of Cole Warwick and seen exactly which lever to push, the way she looked at her land at 2 in the morning in a northerly and understood what it needed. She looked at me like that, like she had taken full account of what I was, had found it satisfactory, and intended to proceed. Nobody in my life had ever looked at me like that, not like I was handsome or young or useful for one season's work, like I was the thing she'd looked at clearly and chosen, with full knowledge, and was not going to reconsider. Preacher Nell said the words. Afterward, outside in the cold December air, Delia Crane, Delia Britton, though she told me later she intended to keep the crane for business purposes, which was fine by me and frankly made sense, stood beside me on the church steps while 2 or 3 people filed past and offered the restrained congratulations of a town that hadn't predicted this outcome. She had her hand through my arm, and she stood the way she always stood, straight and easy, like she was on her own ground, which she always was. Garfield shook my hand with both of his and said nothing at all. His eyes were wet, which he would have denied. Cole Warwick was not there. He sent no word. The south fence line has been quiet ever since. We have been married 3 years and some months now. I am 29. She is 45 and will tell you so without hesitation if you ask, and once put a woman from the next county in her place for trying to make a thing of the age difference, quietly and completely and without raising her voice, which I could have told that woman was going to happen. The land is still hers. The cattle are ours. I built a new section of barn last spring, proper lumber, not the patched-together thing that was there before, and I did it the way Garfield taught me, and she let me do it without offering direction, which is how I knew she trusted my judgment. When it was done, she walked through it and put her hand on the framing and said, "Good." That one word from her is worth a speech from anyone else. I think about the man I was riding into her gate that first evening, hat in my hand, swallowing my pride, certain I was walking into something diminishing. I did not know then what she had already understood, which was that there is no dignity in going unwitnessed, in doing good work that no one with any clarity sees. I had been doing good work my whole life in places where it didn't register. She registered it from the 3rd week. She registered it and she said so, in her flat, accurate way, and it landed differently than I could have told you it would. This is what I want to tell you, if you're the man I think you are, the man who's been doing the work, carrying the weight, putting himself last, and wondering if anyone's actually looking. Some people can see it and some can't. The ones who can't never will. But there are women in this world who see clearly, who choose with full knowledge and no apology, and who, when they put their hand through your arm on the steps of a small church in December, mean it in a way that doesn't require explanation or ceremony. Robbles is still with me. He's gray around the muzzle now. The red roan gelding, she named him Tuesday eventually, which I feel was a comment directed at me, is the best cutting horse on the property. The honeysuckle has grown up both posts of the gallery now. Some mornings I get up early before she does, before Garfield and the two new hands are up, and I stand on that gallery in the first light and look out over the land, the grass and the limestone and the tank catching the sky, and I think, I was a debt. I was a debt, and I rode here and I stayed, and this is mine too now. Not the title, not the deed, something the deed can't hold. And then she comes out with 2 cups of coffee, because she's always been 1 sentence ahead of where she seems to be done, and she stands beside me, and we look at it together. That's the whole of it, that's everything.